This episode of the Magdala podcast is sponsored by the Catholic Theology Show, presented by Ave Maria University. The Catholic Theology Show covers themes such as the value of a Catholic higher education, religious liberty, how to pray, the philosophies of St. Thomas Aquinas, and more. Stream episodes on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and learn more by visiting the link below. Hey there, my name is Rachel Kolacki, and welcome to the Magdala podcast. We at Magdala know from experience that pornography, masturbation, and other sexual addictions are not just a guy problem. The need for women to be accompanied in the journey towards healing from addiction has gone sorely unmet, and that's why we're here. Magdala exists as a space where women can find hope, healing, and freedom alongside each other from sexual addiction. Our goal is to supply you with support, community, and accountability. Here on the podcast, you'll find everything from testimonies to practical advice to dialogue about how to heal and live fully as a Catholic woman. Wherever you are in your journey, know that you're not alone, and we welcome you to this table. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Magdala podcast. I'm Rachel Kolacki, your hostess. And today we're going to be writing solo for this episode. So I wanted to talk about a question that I get a lot when I'm doing an interview. So whether that's a radio interview, a podcast interview, something surrounding my book, whatever. I've noticed a trend of people opening with a question that sounds a little bit like this. So we all know that men are visual and that's why porn hooks them. So how exactly are women getting addicted and why? Don't women just want romance? I thought women were always wanting romance. So I get an iteration of this question basically at the beginning of every interview I have. I've learned to just kind of have a packaged stock answer to it, but I wanted to address the assumptions that I find in this question, and why I don't think they're true, but also why I think they can be potentially pretty harmful. So the first assumption that I find in a question like that of men are visual, women want romance, why would women watch porn? The first assumption that I find in that question is that people think that pornography is solely visual content. And then second, that women are not visual, especially as it pertains to their sexuality. So kind of going after that first assumption, I think that tends to come from a lack of recognition of the evolution of the porn industry in recent decades. So the porn industry was kind of understood to be formalized in kind of the era of Hugh Hefner and Playboy. It expanded from there, but I think when we're talking about pornography and men being visual, women not being visual, I think we're still thinking in that kind of framework of pornography used to be picture based. It used to be pictures of women, typically objectifying women. So its target was a male audience. And very much the porn that was being produced was through that male gaze of what's going to attract men and get their money and their time. So I think if we think about the fact that pornography has expanded so far beyond hard copy photographs, magazines, that sort of thing, even beyond like a store where you have to go and buy these things. Even when it expanded into film, you still had to go to a store to buy, right? But now we're kind of in an era of what clinicians talk about as the AAA influence. So when an addictive substance or behavior is accessible, affordable, and anonymous, and we are in that in spades in our modern era when it comes to porn. So in the modern era, streaming internet porn has granted our culture all three of those things. It's incredibly accessible, it's incredibly affordable because it's free typically, and it's totally anonymous, especially with the advent of the smartphone. So back when Playboy and, similar magazines were the most common form of porn consumption, it could be said that the majority of porn use was done by men. That was absolutely true. So I think when we're still operating from that framework, of course, we would say men are visual. Porn is visual. How could women want porn? So I think we need to expand our definition of pornography, first of all, into other arenas that are kind of just as proliferated and just as harmful as visual video, internet streaming pornography. So there's erotica, for instance. That's consumed by women in really high volumes and higher volumes than men. And it kind of comes about in very sneaky forms. So a lot of romance novels bridge into kind of the erotica topic because of graphic sexual scenes or content. Anna Lemke, who wrote Dopamine Nation, talks about her own addiction to erotica in her book. And I was really grateful for her transparency, because I think one of the most insidious things about erotica is it does kind of particularly attract women who are in kind of unsatisfying relationships for whatever reason, where that's emotionally unsatisfying, sexually unsatisfying. And Lemke actually talks about that she became addicted to erotica in kind of a period of crisis in her marriage, or a period of kind of distance. So kind of statistically, erotica is consumed mostly by heterosexual women who are in committed relationships. So just because it flies under the radar does not mean that it's less harmful than visual porn, less proliferated, and actually it's targeting a very specific audience, and it's doing that quite well. So I think its danger actually can kind of come in the fact that it's flying under the radar. Audio porn is also a form that's on the rise as of recent years, and there are platforms that are specifically devoted to it. And also statistically, women are consuming higher rates or higher volumes of audio pornography than men are. I think because erotica and pornography, or audio porn, also both kind of tap into this imaginative side of women's sexuality, which we've talked about on the podcast a bit before, that women's imagination kind of plays as a mediator in their sexual experiences. So our imaginations are very active, even in our committed sexual relationships. And it's about kind of harnessing that imagination and regrounding it in reality. We had an episode on fantasy, I think last week. So I would encourage you guys to listen to that if you're just kind of wondering how to recognize the value and the gift of women's imagination in their sexuality, but how to always ground it in reality and presence, especially if you are in a committed marriage and have a sexual relationship with someone, and how to not let fantasy kind of take over that. So basically, just to say, pornography takes on many mediums, and I think when we're saying men are visual, therefore they're addicted to porn, women could never be, we're ignoring these kind of subtopics or sub mediums of pornography, but we're also kind of downplaying them and saying that some forms of pornography are perhaps acceptable or less proliferated, and then visual porn is the only one that's really doing any harm. So I think if we can turn our gaze, number one, to a wider definition of pornography that is ever evolving and will continue to evolve. I've encountered subcategories of pornography that I never ever thought I would through my work. But if we kind of expand our definition, then we're able to actually recognize everybody's suffering and help them in the specific way that they need. But then if we could also just turn our gaze to the harm that this is doing to people and kind of let that be our evaluator. So if I evaluate what is pornography based on a very limited definition, I'm going to, again, miss a lot of people's suffering. But if I focus on people's suffering and be like, okay, what kind of trauma do you have from what you've consumed? What kind of harms, what kind of addictive behaviors are you finding yourself in? Looks like something similar to pornography addiction. Okay, therefore I'm going to count it in that category, right? Even if it kind of challenges our definition of what we always thought pornography was and how people function when they're consuming it. So I hope that makes sense. That's a little rambly, but the second big misconception in the question of men are visual, women want romance, yada, 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 is that women are not visual. And I do think this is a misconception, because I think women are visual. I think, again, we have that intermediary of the imagination. So I think when we're talking about this, like men's visual nature, women's emotional nature, we're kind of creating a false dichotomy. I do think women are very naturally, beautifully relational. That's, I think, something bestowed on us by God, a way that we serve him and image him in our vocations. But I think, number one, acting like men don't have that ability, a deep desire for emotional connection and an ability for it, I think is harmful to men. But I also thinking discounting women's visual nature, their potential to be sexually tempted, that sort of thing, I think it's really limiting. So I think this view was kind of popularized, like really, really popularized in kind of the 70s, 80s, at the beginning of evangelical purity culture, and then kind of moving into more recent decades. I'm thinking of books like Emerson Eggerich's Love and Respect, of like, women want love, men want respect. And again, there's probably some truths to that, right? I'm not disregarding the truths, but men also want love, women also want respect, right? So I think I'm very hesitant towards models that completely separate man and woman, instead of beginning from kind of the base of like common humanity, and then how that expands out into a masculine and a feminine way. Which I think John Paul II's theology of the body does, for instance, is there's kind of a common human experience, and then how does that human experience manifest in the feminine way? How does that manifest in the masculine? So I tend to just kind of bristle a little bit at these false dichotomies, or these extreme dichotomies, even if they may have some truth to them. But I think that this kind of polarizing thing, or this polarizing mindset, especially when we're talking about women consuming porn, and why would they ever, because they're not visual, it kind of, first of all, it really kind of hits home a narrative that's been harmful for women who are struggling with sexual sin in the church. But it also just kind of embeds a really harmful view of women's sexuality in general. So I think that when I'm asked this question, sometimes I feel like I have to almost defend the fact that women have sexual desire in the first place, of like, women just want romance. It's like, well, yes, of course I want romance, but I'm also a sexual being. Like, and we have to almost defend that. Whereas I think men kind of entering into the conversation are already understood to be sexual beings. So I think these questions can be harmful because they make women defend a very natural part of themselves and kind of look at that with sort of this antagonistic view, or just completely disregard it. I think a lot of messages that were given to young women, young Catholic women specifically, or young Christian women, in recent decades were very much surrounding modesty. Were driven by this attitude that we needed to temper men's lust. We needed to be almost like scared of their visual nature. There was just so much talk about that. I remember receiving so many things about that, of just like, men are visual, and we need to guard their hearts, guard their eyes, all sorts of things. And the conversation would even turn, when it came to sexual sin, for women to like asking for women to set the standard for purity in their relationships. I remember one talk that I heard was they literally said verbatim, if you set the standard for purity, a real man will rise up to it. I think that is really, really hard to set that on women's shoulders. I think in most relationships, but definitely not all. I think in a majority of relationships, perhaps the man experiences higher libido than his female partner, but that can also switch when she's ovulating, or that can switch at different times of their life, whatever. And I know plenty of women who definitely have higher libidos than their spouses consistently, but this idea of like, you set the standard, and a real man, if he's a real man, will rise up to it. Number one, that discounts the fact that men sin, even really good men, they still fall. They're still tempted as well. So that if that happens, that's not him not rising up to the standard. That's him being human and needing mercy and needing growth. But I think what that also does is, again, kind of sets the burden on women's shoulders of, you have to be the gatekeeper, you have to be the guardian of purity, because you don't have the burden of carrying temptation in your own. So now you have to carry man's burden. Instead of treating women as individuals first, who have to learn to reckon with their own temptation, who have to learn to reckon with their own sexuality and self-mastery in that space. Instead of treating us as kind of the equals in sexuality, and then therefore in potential for sexual temptation. I hope that's making sense. That I think that question carries a misconception, like I think a very harmful one, of like, women carry the burden of man's sexuality because they don't have their own, right? And I'm not in any way advocating against modesty or being aware of men and their needs when it comes to that. I don't talk about modesty a lot publicly because I never make anybody happy when I do. And it's also something that I think women should have a conversation about their sexuality without modesty being brought into it. I think we should have an affirming and honest conversation about our sexuality without it being, therefore be modest and kind of that being the end of the conversation. So that's kind of why I tend to just touch on the topic or avoid it entirely. Is not because I don't think it matters, but because I just feel very called to have those honest conversations without that being the conclusion. So yeah, I just think in this sphere, we have to let the relation to one another go both ways. You know, we have to talk about, yes, how female sexuality relates to male sexuality, but also how male relates to female. We also have to be teaching men how they can protect us as well, how they can be aware of our specific temptations. I think one of the most stunning things about serving in Magdala has been the support, the excitement that comes from men, whether that's, you know, as a donor or just somebody who's praying for us, somebody who reaches out to me. Men have just offered so much encouragement because I think they have been so aware of the struggle with pornography for so long. And so when men are humble enough to recognize that struggle in women as well, there's just such a desire to help. And I just think that's masculinity at its best, right? It's just like, how can I serve? How can I help? How can I love these women? But it's also just, it's a recognition that this goes both ways. All of us are sexual beings. All of us experience temptation. And rather than focusing on comparison of men have it worse, women have it worse, because I don't think that's true for either party, focusing on how can we serve each other? How can we help each other? How can we love each other? Rather than making each other prove what our struggles are to each other. So I'm a big fan, I've talked about this in my book and written about it in other places. I'm a big fan of gendering the solution, not gendering the problem. So what I mean by that is I think pornography and sexual addiction for a long time was gendered, of like, this is a male issue, and wanting romance is and emotional chastity, these are female issues. Whereas I don't think we should gender the problem, because I think pornography is a human issue and lust is a human issue and sexuality is not a human issue, but a human reality. I think we should gender the solution. I think we should have uniquely masculine, male-based, male-centric resources for men who are seeking recovery. And in the same way, I think we should have female-centric resources for women in recovery as well. So that's why Magdala was created, was to be a female-centric community, a female-centric space where women could be women struggling with this, where there would be honesty, but there would also be a desire for just deeply feminine conversation and healing, and that can take on so many different forms. But so I think when we gender the problem, that's when we kind of enter into the competition with one another of like, prove that women struggle with this, or prove that men have it worse, right? Like we kind of enter into this competing rather than, okay, we all have the same problem. Let's go and figure that out together as men, as women, and let's encourage each other in that journey. So I've kind of deviated a little bit. I do think the desire for romance is set in women's heart in a very specific and profound way, but I've also known many men who have that deep desire as well. I think women have an intrinsic capability for deep vulnerability and emotional relationships, which can also just serve in their interior life and their spiritual life. I think all of these things are true. I think that but I think when we just kind of sort women into the box of women just want romance, I do think it's limiting, because I also think that's exactly the desire that the porn industry has hijacked. I think we're also forgetting, like, a lot of pornography depicts scenes, depicts stories, depicts romance even included, even if it's a very, very distorted form of romance. But it's included in these scenes. And so I think when we limit women by a desire for romance, which may be true, we're again operating off of a very false definition of what the porn industry is producing now. So I think that desire for romance, is exactly what the porn industry is really reaching into. And I think it also serves as a place of triggering for women. So a lot of the women in our community, and I know in my own story, there's like a struggle with loneliness, of not being chosen, of rejection, or kind of these wounds surrounding romance. And that can be just a massive triggering space for women too. So I think that also, it kind of speaking into the imagination part, I've talked about this in other podcasts, probably in the one from last week on fantasy, that women use something called mental framing. So basically fantasizing in order to experience arousal. or most women use this. So I think whether the pornography they're consuming is erotica, video, audio, whatever the case, I think that porn now, especially the way it's being produced, incites women to maybe begin by fantasizing about a romantic encounter, but it very quickly turns sexual and very graphically sexual at that. So I think kind of pornography and all of the mediums that it's, created in now really taps into that mental framing ability. So that desire to have romance, that really, really intense capability, that automatic capability to really imagine it, to fantasize about it, very quickly can lead into sexual fantasy and consuming of porn and all of these things. So the fact that women want romance absolutely does not disqualify them from consuming porn. In fact, it qualifies them pretty deeply to consume it. So just kind of like a quick side tangent on that. I think, one more study that I want to share that I found incredibly informative. I've talked about this, I know, in other episodes. Two psychologists showed men and women, a group of men and a group of women, one by one. They showed them the same pornographic content, and then afterward asked them to rate what they attributed their arousal to when watching that content. And the men said the attractiveness of someone in the video. The women said their ability to imagine themselves as somebody in the video. So I think both men and women are visual. They consume visual content, but how they toss that visual content around in their brain and how that visual content relates to their sexual arousal is different. But I think that's where the definition expanding is really important, and the recognition of how women's sexuality operates is really, or tends to operate, is really, really important. The same content can attract us, but with very different uses once we've consumed it. I know I've rambled on quite a bit. This is what happens when I attempt to do a solo episode, but I obviously want to give like grace when I get this question, because I think interviewers are asking not only for themselves, but what they know their audience might be thinking. So I know that this is a narrative that is still shifting very widely in secular culture, but also in the church, is that women can struggle with sexual sin and addiction. But I think the sooner that we change these mindsets and these misconceptions, the better, because women are being left in silence, or they're being rejected when they finally do bring up their struggle. I can't tell you how many really negative, really discouraging comments I've gotten on this. I think it's horrible to speak to a fellow human being that way, first of all, but I think it's also, it's not what the church is. We're not supposed to leave each other alone in our sin. We're supposed to reach out a hand. So if perhaps some of these misconceptions are something you're still holding, that the really polarized dichotomy of men are visual and women want romance, and so therefore men want sex and women want romance, or men want respect and women want love, I would just encourage you to perhaps entertain the idea of starting with a foundation of what is humanity? What does human nature want? What is it ordered towards? What is human sexuality? What are some complementary differences that manifest in the masculine and the feminine? But what is humanity? And also, how can we come alongside each other as one human body rather than men versus women? Where am I competing with the men in my life to show my worth? Or men, where are you competing with the women in your life to kind of regain a stature or something? So I think this plays out in conversations surrounding sexuality, but I think it plays out in many areas as well. And then second, if you think women aren't visual and aren't sexual beings, you don't have to think about that too much. You just have to know that we are. So I think the sooner these mindsets change, the better. And yeah, I think that's all I got. We'll catch you next week back on the Magdala podcast. Thanks for listening. If you like this episode, feel free to like, subscribe, or share with a friend. If you're interested in supporting the work that we're doing in Magdala and also gaining access to more exclusive content, consider joining us as a patron on our Patreon. You can find that link in the show notes below. If you'd like to support the work Magdala is doing as a donor, you can also find the link to join our support team in the show notes below. If you are in need of a Covenant Eyes subscription and want to give it a try, you can use the code Magdala for 30 days free. You can find that link in the show notes as well. To join a virtual small group or learn more about our resources, visit magdalaministries.org. And then finally, if you want to get the light phone and live a more peaceful life, you can find our affiliate link in the show notes below as well. God bless you all, and we'll catch you soon.